Thank you, Mubarak. Thank you for the invitation. You made out to me. I'm really pleased to be here and see your group. The work I'm presenting is joint work, collaborative work between my groups based in Sydney and the very famous group of Professor Bunke based in the University of Bern in Switzerland. His son was here a few months ago. Some of you might have got acquainted with him. He's been a visitor to UCF and your group across the end of last year and the beginning of this year. Today's outline includes my own introduction to graphs that I call the practitioner's introduction because I do not claim to be a researcher or expert in this field, but I'll give you a practical viewpoint that could be useful for other applications in vision. I will talk about the graph edit distance, present a particular graph edit distance that we used in this work, talk about graph embedding, and present the traditional methods that I decide to call generative methods, and present our own methods that we decide to call discriminative by contrast. Some experimental results and conclusion. So, as all of you certainly know from various corners of research, the fundamental properties of graph is that of being able to capture, to represent structure in data. Data of very varied nature, as you can see in this slide. I mean, you mentioned data that can be as diverse as characters, fingerprints, digits, but also more virtual graphs like graphs over web documents, other types of data, any data that potentially embeds structure. The structure can be represented by a graph. As you talk about graph more formally, you can define graphs in various ways. The definition that I borrow today is a definition of the attributed graph. An attributed graph is just presented as a tuple where you got a set of nodes or vertices, a set of edges, and over each node and each edge you have essentially a label. The label is typically a number. It's typically a numerical label that quantifies something, like an attribute, a numerical attribute. The graphs are really a large field of research, and I've tried to master most of the important results. If you study graphs formally, you will find that there are many theoretical results on, for instance, shortest path between any two nodes in a graph. You will find results over the number of spanning trees, minimum spanning trees. There is a number of other properties that go under the name of coverings, matchings. But what is lacking fundamentally in graphs is something equivalent to simple operations such as sums and products. There is some types of product like tensor products, but you don't have anything comparable to sums and products in vector spaces. So if you think about all the literature on classification algorithm, it relies heavily on basic operations, arithmetic operations that you can perform in feature spaces or vector spaces. In graph domain, you can't perform the same. So you're faced with the difficulty in the mathematical manipulation of the graphs as a data structure. Just to mention it, because I'm sure most of you have worked with probabilistic models or even with maximum margin models, graphs are also the language behind graphical models. Graphical models are, in fact, a combination of graphs and probabilities. In particular, in this case, the attributes that we mentioned before are probability values. The labeling function can be seen as a bit more complicated, but if you look at this slide, you can see that now what does a graphical model represent? Essentially a factorization for a probability. Directed and undirected graphs still represent a factorization with different properties of factors. If you work in logarithmic scale, a product becomes a sum. So you can think of those quantities as cumulative additive quantities similar to the distances between the nodes of a graph. So the similarities or commonalities between graphs and graphical models are really many, and sort of emphasize the fact that graphical models are, in a sense, graphs in the very first place. So graphs are very interesting representations, but lack the same level of mathematical treatment of operations that points in vector spaces do. The first or main operation we are very interested in performing in graphs domain are operations of matching of two graphs. Matching of two graphs should not be confused with matchings over a graph. Matchings over a graph are a different type of properties. We are talking about comparing any two graphs given to you. Let's say graph G1, graph G2. I want to know how similar or dissimilar graphs G1 and G2 are with respect to each other. So this operation of graph matching, again, attracts really a large amount of literature. If you're talking about graphs laid out over data from signal processing or computer vision, you will inevitably have to point to something like inexact graph matching, which is kind of a relaxation, where you can basically match or quantify the distance between a graph with any arbitrary number of nodes and another graph with equally arbitrary number of nodes and edges and structures which can be apparently completely different. So how do you perform this graph matching? Essentially, you define a distance. This type of distance is defined as an edit distance because it allows you, through a sequence of edit operations, to morph graph G1 into graph G2. So it's a transformation that transforms one graph into the other, and as you do it through a sequence of steps, you accumulate the cost of each step. The graph edit distance, actually, the edit transformation itself, is computed over 6 different types of operations. There's 3 basic types of operations for nodes and 3 equally basic types of operations for vertices or for edges. The nodes are either between the two graphs substituted, which means you find a node in graph 1 and a node in graph 2 and you replace them, taking into account the labels of both. Or you can have an insertion of a node in graph G1 or a deletion of a node in graph G1 so as to make this graph in the end identical to graph G2. So what you do, basically, you assign a cost to these edit operations. The cost can be fixed or can be depending on the value of the labels, on the relevant nodes and relevant edges, or could even be learned. The cost can be learned from frequencies, maximum likelihood. There's many different ways to basically find the costs of the atomic edit operations. As we see in this slide more formally, what we call the distance is the cost of the edit operations over what you would call the minimum cost edit path. The edit path is defined here with this notation, is just the sequence of the atomic edit operations that will transform G1 into G2. Has arbitrary length, not necessarily the shortest in terms of the least number of operations is the best. What you're trying to find is basically an argmean over all possible edit paths, transforming G1 into G2 and the associated cost. You're looking at the sequence of operations that will lead to a minimum cost edit path.
So the cost includes the node cost and the edge cost? Or?
The cost includes cost for substituting or inserting or deleting nodes, and likewise for edges. Yeah. So this edit operation or edit transformation is the fundamental way to attribute a distance between two graphs like G1, G2, Gi, Gj, however you want to note. Now, so I'm trying to explain that this idea of the edit path can be seen like a virtual graph over the two graphs, let's say G1 and G2. Instead of thinking of G1 and G2 just as graphs, think of them as nodes of a much bigger virtual graph. And in between G1 and G2, as intermediate nodes, are all the partially edited graphs that move from G1 to G2. And you're trying, in each edge of this virtual graph, you have a cost, which is the cost of the edit operation that partially edits the graph until you move from G1 to G2. So if you think of this edit operation in these terms as nodes of a virtual graph that transform the first graph into the second one, what you have is a shortest path. So all the algorithms that are used for shortest path, like Dijkstra, A star, other B star, other algorithms can be used to find a minimum cost edit path between graph G1 and G2. This is the fundamental result. No? Framing this in terms of an edit distance over the best path calls for that category of algorithm that find shortest path or best path across 2 points. So this is the fundamental result. But the problem is that no matter how more efficient A star could be over a standard algorithm like Dijkstra, one of the problems is that of the combinatorial explosion of the number of these intermediate nodes. For basically, if you have a certain number of nodes in G1 and G2, the number of combinations of possible paths is exponential. So you cannot just explore all of them brute force with whatever best first or strategy. If you have graphs of considerable size, the number of operations is typically very big and can become unmanageable. So for this reason, on the side of the exact algorithm that find the exact shortest path from G1 to G2, you have another number of algorithms that find approximated distances. What we used in this work is in fact an approximated distance. So what we used here is the bipartite graph edit distance. The bipartite graph edit distance was defined by Bunke's group a few years ago. As I said just a second ago, is an approximated distance between G1 and G2 that works more or less like this. First of all, takes into account only the nodes. All the nodes of graph G1 and all the nodes of graph G2 are transformed into each other, assigned. Basically, it's an assignment algorithm based on the Hungarian scheme. It takes into account substitutions cost, but takes into account also insertion and deletion. So in terms only of nodes assignment, you find the optimal assignment takes into account any possible combination of node operation costs. The problem with this approach is that you would dismiss completely any cost associated with edge operations, which of course instead need to be accounted for. So how this works is, every time you consider a possible node operation, you have a set of compatible edge operations, each having a certain cost. You pick, of all the edge operations, the one with minimum cost. So if you're performing the node operation, you can add a cost to that node operation that comes from the minimum cost or lower bound edge cost associated with the node operation. So in that sense, the bipartite edit distance is a bit more sophisticated than just a node assignment. Is an optimal node assignment plus lower bound on the corresponding edge operations.
So the bipartite, the two partitions are the nodes in one graph and nodes in other graph,
yes.
Right? And then you're saying, given a node in this graph, then you look at all possible nodes you can replace in that graph?
What you build is a large matrix of costs that has the number of columns and the number of rows equal to the sum of the number of nodes in both graphs. So if one has n nodes, the other has m nodes, you have an n plus m times n plus m cost matrix. That includes all possibilities of substitutions between these nodes and insertion of nodes or deletion of nodes. So the matrix is always a square size, even if the two graphs have different sizes. So you can always compute an optimal assignment problem, even if the graphs have arbitrary number of nodes.
Each element represents what in that matrix?
Each element is the cost for an assigned operation, one of these edit operations between nodes. So in basically one go, applying something like the Hungarian algorithms, you can find the optimal assignment of nodes from one graph to the other. Overlaid to the cost for the node substitution, you have the cost for the corresponding minimum cost for the edge operations. So you're finding an optimum based on actual cost for the node operations and like a lower estimate for the cost of the edge operation. That's how the bipartite graph distance is. After you've done that, you can actually compute the real cost for edges, but you don't take them into account into the selection of the edit path. Because if you take into account edge operations, then the edit path selection goes back to sequential, and you go back to algorithm like A star and best first search. So you have to carry out. This is not a sequential algorithm. This algorithm performs the assignment in one go. And in terms of speed, reading that paper, you'll find is 50 to 100 times faster than A star on all the tested data sets. So basically, the take-home message for this is that this type of relaxation makes edit distance computable over graphs of typically larger size. How large, that depends on a number of things. Yes, please.
So when an insertion of a node happens, so how the algorithm decides what edges should be connected connect with that node? Like some edges which might not exist in the original form would be added to, or?
Well, you have to balance the possibility to insert an edge if the node didn't exist, or delete an edge if the node is deleted. So that there's a number of possible operations on edges that would be compatible with that particular node operation that you're selecting. And out of all of them, one would have the minimum cost. And that's what you're able to add statically to the cost matrix, which is essentially a static matrix.
And what would be the criteria for like this compatibility that you said, like whether these two nodes in the transformed graph and this particular node, one of them is actually added node, it didn't exist before. What is that like compatibility criteria, whether those to be compatible?
I'm not entirely sure in the sense that delete. I just presume you cannot add an edge that doesn't have two. An edge is defined as a pair of nodes, the two extremes. If you don't have the extremes, you can't insert that edge. So it's a simple compatibility like that.
So here by node operation, do you mean node insertion or deletion, or do you mean node assignment?
Node insertion, deletion, or substitution, which is an operation of pairing. You are pairing node B of graph 1 with node D of graph 2, node A or B having, say, label 25 and the other having label 36. So based on this information, which label is carried in the node in graph 1 and the node in graph 2, you have a cost for the operation.
And that cost would be the n by n matrix?
Yes, that cost is exactly the entry in the n plus n matrix.
That matrix, will it only have the node label cost or also the edge cost?
You add the edge cost of the minimum edge operation that you have associated with that node operation. Could even be 0.
So all the costs of the possible edge operations, you cannot pre-compute them before you start the assignment of algorithm, right? Because then there is no gain in that possibility.
No, exactly.
So you only do it for the ones that the greedy approach is doing.
Yeah, you only do basically a lower estimate and the actual cost will be higher. And in that sense, the algorithm is suboptimal. What I know of this, if you can see also from the relevant publication, is that the accuracy on cross-validation tests is comparable to that of A star, like an exact algorithm. And speed, as I said, typically is 50 to 100, sometimes even faster. Depends, data dependent, but it's typically much, much faster than A star. So the workaround for the scarcity of mathematical operations on graph is typically, or at least there's a school of thought in the graph research community that tries to get rid of the graph, let me say, as soon as possible. So the graph is strong, you build it for representing the structure in your data, but as soon as you build the graph, you try to convert it into a feature vector. And this operation, as you probably know, is called graph embedding. You embed the graph into vector space. When you read the literature on graph embedding, you pay a bit of attention to the fact that the same expression, graph embedding, is used for two very different things. One is to take the graph as a whole, and the graph as a whole is mapped into a point in feature space. Another is to take each node of a graph and individually map the nodes into a vector space. And this is not what we refer to. So we refer to graph embedding as one graph, one point. It's ambiguous. When you read papers, you will come across this ambiguity pretty quickly. So there's many different ways. I mean, one way that I'm citing in the footnote here is a paper from Hancock that says that you can take the graph, compute the adjacency metrics across the nodes, turn it into the Laplacian, and perform some manipulation that gives you polynomial coefficients, and those polynomial coefficients could be seen as a feature vector representation of a graph. So it's not only one way to perform this, but the most common way to do an embedding of a graph is by a dissimilarity space. Get your own set of templates, or call them prototypes, typically called prototypes. You choose the prototypes and you use the prototype to represent the differences of your graph, or distances between your graph and this set of n prototypes, P1, Pn. The idea is something like this. It's very simple to catch. You have a graph, a probe graph, and you have this, you may have as prototype these 3 or 4 graphs and you measure the distances, this distance supposedly would lead you with a set, the feature vector becomes nothing else than the concatenation of the distances between the graph and this template, the graph and this template, the graph and this template, and so on. So the feature vector is the set of distances or dissimilarities between the prop graph and your prototype set.
So what are these prototypes represent? Just remove one of the node or something? What are these?
These prototypes are just prototypes in a training set. You assume you have a large training set of your graphs. Could be class-based, supervised, or unsupervised. We'll talk about this in a sec, but it's essentially a subset of your training set that you choose to encode distances between this probe graph and each element in the set. So the idea, more or less, is that when you're measuring this distance, should be low. This distance should be significantly higher because of the greater difference in structure between this graph and this graph. When you're measuring this distance, again, should be pretty high. So it gives you measurement, an accounting of the dissimilarity between the probe graph, and should lead to somehow an informative embedding, which could lead obviously to classification if you assume that these are classes of letters and you want to recognize the letter class, but could also be used for other things, not necessarily just for classification, for clustering, for any other task.
E and L, these are just the names of different graphs?
Yes, well, they are sort of an iconic representation for one or two or three templates, yes, that you choose to be your set of prototypes. So this is the idea between prototype set based embedding. There's more or less two areas of application. One is to unsupervised problems where the training set doesn't come with any class label. And what is the guiding principle in that case? Could be somehow the idea of spreading the prototype set in a uniform way. You don't have anything like an eigendecomposition. If you're treating feature vectors, you can use PCA. PCA is a form of embedding from high dimensions to lower dimensions. What you use that for is eigenvectors. Eigenvectors now help you project your data from one space to the other and create the embedding. In this case, you don't have anything like a scalar product. You don't have multiplication sum. So again, a bit scarce in even the conversion tools. The conversion tools are based on this notion of distance, which is the only thing you basically have available. If you are dealing instead with supervised problems, which means you have class labels on your training set, another way to choose a good set is by cross-validation. Whatever gives you good cross-validation accuracy is probably a good prototype set for the purpose of classification. But how many combinations of prototype sets can you try? The subsets out of a set are a huge number, so it's basically not possible to just generate and try all combinations, test the cross-validation accuracy to select the prototype set. So these problems have led to the fact that in this field of literature, all techniques to select sets of prototypes are heuristics. Heuristics that try to look at the most plausible way to search for a good set of prototypes for embedding, and of course then validate this choice by measurement of cross-validation accuracy. So these are some popular techniques, once again is a Bunke's paper, that have been put forward in the past for selecting prototype sets. Go under the name of random selection, center-based selection, border-based selection, and various other names. I'm not going to go in the detail of these because I'm going to present in detail the corresponding discriminative techniques that we have proposed in our paper. But I can show you this picture. This picture shows how prototype selection works for some of the conventional methods. And the picture is obviously an embedding at its own turn from multidimensional scaling in 2D. The technique up here is just a random selection. This is the center-based selection, tends to pick the prototypes from the center of the training set. The boundary selection or border selection, obviously at odds, chooses the prototypes from the borders of the training set. This is the target sphere. I'll explain a bit better later how it works, spanning prototype selection, and a form of k-medoid prototype selection. So you see that visually the differences in selecting the set are major, depending on which heuristics you choose to adopt.
Each point in this is a graph, right?
Yes.
A prototype graph.
1 point, 1 graph.
One graph. And the problem is what? That you have to select and you're given another graph, you want to select closer to that graph? What's the problem?
The problem here is that if I'm given one graph,
Yeah.
and I want to classify that graph, and I want to use a standard classification algorithm, SVM or anything, I need to be able to turn that graph into a feature vector of fixed size, by the way, not of variable size. My graph can have any arbitrary number of nodes and edges, and they need to be converted to the same vector size in all cases. So what you're doing here, you're choosing a number of prototypes, a subset of the training set, and at runtime, to create the feature vector for this graph, you will measure its distance from this graph, from this graph, from this graph, one by one, from each graph in the prototype set. And then you will encode the entire feature vector.
Okay, so
It's possible also to measure, in theory, in principle, the distance of this graph from any other graph in the training set, and then maybe use dimensionality reduction straight after, like PCA, to reduce the feature vector to a reasonable dimensionality.
Main point is that instead of saving all these graphs, so you want to save some principal prototypes which can use as basis to compute a distance from any of the graphs. Is that the idea?
Yes. Well, the role of these prototypes is exactly the role of eigenvectors in PCA. PCA converts from a high-dimensional vector space to a low-dimensional vector space. Here we are converting from a known vector space to a vector space.
And what's the intuition of why you have so many prototypes? Because of each prototype is a training example or something, or what's the?
Rules of thumb once more, and again validation by the experiments, but the idea is that the more graphs you have in the prototype set, you add more information. If you miss some prototypes, then you may miss differences between graphs that are important for the later classification. So in theory, you would like to have a very large prototype set, but if you are having too many, possibly you fall into the usual issues of curse of dimensionality, or even this feature vector may become so big and so noisy to some extent that then when you want to use the feature vectors for classification, it may fail. So not necessarily the more the better.
So you have lots of prototypes and you are given input graph and you want to find
Yep.
a distance of input graph.
Yeah, from all of them, one by one.
I see.
These distances are packed into a feature vector, and this feature vector is used with any conventional statistical classifier.
I see. Okay.
It's a pre-processing or initial conversion step.
Okay.
I was just going to ask, which distance are you using to create this prototype? Is it the Bipartite?
Yes. Yes. These graphs are coming from a bipartite edit distance. You wouldn't see much of a difference in the behavior of the different heuristics, even if you're using something like the probabilistic JED or other graph edit distances. The sort of relative behavior of concentrating or spreading will stay also with different type of edit distances.
How are you doing the visualization here? Because like each node is represented by two-dimensional vector. So like how did you find that to show this? So these nodes.
If you're familiar with data embedding like multidimensional scaling, or all you need is a matrix of mutual distances. You got your training set and samples, and you can do an embedding. So once you got the distances between any two arguments, you can do that. So the techniques we presented before, or actually I just mentioned them, I named them, are techniques that fit, in a way, the choice of prototypes for a given class only based on the training set for that class. So if you are given some samples graph from class letter A in the letter classification problem, you will find the prototypes for class A. Then you move to class B, then you move to class C, and you select your prototypes. You don't have to select the same number of prototypes per class because they all contribute to the feature vector in the end. You can choose different numbers, but you choose them separately, class by class. What is that common with? Obviously with likelihood fitting. No? When you're fitting a class likelihood in a Bayesian classifier, you are fitting a likelihood function over a population of samples that come from that class. Then you move to the next class. So all these fittings, like the prototype selection in this case, are based on samples from one class at a time. Well, it's quite obvious, I would say, to think that there may be better ways to choose these prototypes for one class, not using only the samples from that class, but using the samples from the class and the samples from the remaining classes in a discriminative way. By the end of the day, these prototypes need to feed a classifier. So in a supervised, labeled problem, you want them to be class discriminative. Why not select the prototypes in a discriminative manner, exactly like in a discriminative probabilistic classifier, you will choose the parameters for each class jointly, as a joint parameter estimation problem. So this is basically the intuition that has led to this work. Take all the conventional techniques that fit prototype selection on each class at a time and change it into a corresponding discriminative technique that has an objective that is a trade-off between the fitting in the class and the fitting versus the remaining classes. So it's perfectly analogous as an idea of discriminative training of probabilistic classifier versus generative training. So with that, I will just present the specific techniques. The first technique we proposed is an adaptation of the center-based. The center-based technique is the technique that concentrates all the prototypes in the center of the training set. In that function, we have changed, this would be the objective. We have added this objective. Look, the notation seems a little bit heavy, but it's very, very simple. It simply means that we're looking for a candidate graph, Gj, to become the next prototype for that class. Next in the sense that the selection of prototypes is incremental. We first select prototype 1, then select prototype 2, then we select as many prototypes as we like for each class, selecting the first, and then progressing. So this is the selection of the kth prototype. We explore all the graphs in that class that have not already been selected as prototypes, so whatever has been left out so far. We select the graph G and J that has the closest sum of distances from its other companion graphs in that class, so minimizes the distance with respect to the other graphs in the class and maximizes the distance, this is the discriminative term, between this graph and the graphs in the other classes. It's the analogous of minimizing the scatter matrix, maximizing compactness within class, and maximizing separation between classes. It's like in LDA objective. Now there are these two objectives. One takes into account the compactness, and the other enforces separation. The two coefficients WS, WC are just positive coefficients, so when you basically increase in this term, the objective goes down. You're looking for a minimum, and that minimum is achieved as a trade-off of making the distances within class small and making the distance between that new prototype and the remaining graphs in other classes big. Simple idea. Yes, please.
So when you want to maximize the distance between the sample from class Cn from the remaining Cn bar, so do you compare it with the all samples from remaining classes or just the hard negative ones?
We had two strategies there. We compared it against all the graphs from the other classes and from graphs from one selected most offending class that we call the nearest class. So we have these two types of strategies, and I'll present a couple of results later. So this is the first technique. There's a few more to come. But the idea is, I'll talk a bit more in general in a second. I'll first present this. This is the border. If you remember, the border is the selection that finds the prototypes all around the boundaries of the training set. That term that is still here. This term is responsible for the border selection. But in addition to that, we also add the separation between the prototype candidate and all the graphs in the remaining classes. Is an argmax, just for notation. So we are trying to make that as big as possible by adding and trading off, making as large as possible distances within class this time. We're not looking at compactness, it's the opposite. We're looking at spread within class and spread between classes. Now, it's plausible to ask, I mean, why is contradictory with what we did before? It's really heuristics nature. There is no necessarily good, and you will see also from the empirical results, that is not obvious that choosing the center is a priori better than choosing the boundaries. They could lead to discriminative and informative embeddings, either of them, and the following techniques likewise. So unfortunately, a priori, we don't have any reasons to opt for one or the other. This technique is the repelling prototype. The repelling prototype selection has another idea, that every time I choose a prototype in my class, I will try to choose another prototype that is far from the prototypes. Not just far from the remaining graphs, but this time to increase the scatter between prototypes, amongst prototypes. And this is given by this term here. This is the edit term. And as you see, this term sums distances that run over the prototype selected up to k-1, the up to now selected prototypes. We try to maximize the distances from them to scatter the prototypes chosen for that class. Now you could wonder why this term is in a product with the other term instead of a sum. And the answer is that I really have no good reasons for that. Because being the nature of these techniques completely heuristic, you can create product rules. You can create sum rules. You don't know a priori which type of scale you're working with, logarithmic, natural, and you can create sums of products and combinations of anything that comes to your mind is a possible technique that could lead to a higher cross-validation accuracy than others. So there's no set rule to create these combined objectives, and that also leaves room to create more. I mean, one can try with different objectives that combine the same principles in different ways to obtain a higher possible accuracy. Now, so I have a couple more, and I'll finish with that, with the presentation of the methods. One is this spanning prototype selection. If you compare it with the previous slide, with a little bit of patience, you will see that this term appeared in the previous slide. This term appeared in the previous slide. We don't have anymore the centralizing term, the terms that enforces or suggest centralization in the selection. And this time, the two terms are traded off in sum rather than product. The second last is called target sphere prototype selection. The second term in the objective, this term here is analogous to the previous, is enforcing separation between classes. And this term here enforces the choice of prototypes that are in proportional distances from the center. Let me explain with the next picture, which is much easier to understand. Prototype selection here selects the first two prototypes in a separate way. Prototype P1 is chosen by the center-based technique. So it will be somewhere in the center of the training set. Prototype P2 is chosen by the border selection technique. So it will be somewhere at the boundaries. Now, if you measure the distance between the first prototype and the second, you have a good estimate for the radius. The radius of that class, of the training set for that class. So the idea is like in a target sphere, concentric circles, to divide the distance between the center and the boundary prototypes in regular intervals that define intermediate radii. So for P3, the next first real prototype, you will look for a prototype that is as close as possible to this distance from P1, and this would be perhaps P3. For the next circle, you will look for a prototype P4 that is somewhere close to this circle and maybe this one. So you will pick the prototype that is the closest as possible as a nominated distance that increases proportionally to the distance between the center and the periphery. Again, what's the principle? Spacing apart in terms of distances, and hoping that that will turn, again, somehow discriminative. Last is like a combined method, is the equivalent of k-medoids. K-medoids is just k-means with the difference that you're not averaging any point. The idea is simple, and I'll present it very quickly. You use any of the other 5 techniques that we presented so far, and you create a first set of prototypes. After that, you refine it by something similar to the k-means alternate step. The prototypes are the center. You find which of the training set graphs are closer to each of these initial centers, and you start a cycle of assignment, optimization, assignment, optimization. The optimization is a selection step, which is done in also discriminative way, so the discriminative principle behind this technique is preserved. So presented basically 6 techniques, but would be plausible to have more that follow the same idea of combining distances, separations between classes, and other properties of the graphs within the class. Now, coming to the results, we've carried out experiments over a rather diverse set of data sets, including letters, digits, graphs of drawings, fingerprints, a couple of data sets from bioinformatics, proteins, web documents. We have used the Bipartite graph edit distance I presented before as distance, and as classifier we used an SVM with an RBF kernel. All classifications performed with training, validation, and test splits. I can't remember right now exactly what splits we have used, but you can find the details in the paper, carrying the same authorship and probably about the same title. The description of the data set is given here. The fundamental figures are these, the number of nodes and the number of vertices. So as you see, they increase going from top to bottom. And the graphs at the bottom are harder because they have on average a much larger number of nodes and number of edges.
So in this one, like what's the problem is that you have a letter and each letter describes a graph?
Yes, the letters come into only 15 classes, so not all the letters are included.
15 letters.
15 letters types. The digits are all there.
Yeah.
The fingerprint, I care to clarify, is not person recognition task, is only a classification of the fingerprint into 4 classes of a particular anatomical shape. So it's a classification exercise with 4 classes only. It's not.
So but let's look at letters. So there are 15 letters. Each letter is a graph.
Yeah. Each instance is a graph. Yeah.
Each instance of a letter is
Yeah.
a graph. And that, how do you build the graph? Is like you get the image and you find some pixels?
I'll admit straight away I don't know exactly, but I presume that you will look at corner points, and somehow the edges would have to correspond to physical ink edges. So I don't know much about the graph construction.
So like, like objects, they say, you can return objects as a graph, like, different parts of the objects and relationship and so on. So you have a graph.
Yes.
So then, like, you want to recognize these letters,
Yeah.
right? So,
Yeah.
so it's like object recognition
Yeah.
or character recognition. And then, so what is it like? So you're not using like this, you're not using like a standard SVM and feature vector kind of approach. This is
We are using it, but as second step of the processing.
so
The first step is to take the instance of the graph, use a prototype set to turn it into a feature vector,
feature vector.
and after that we train a standard SVM classifier
I see.
in a supervised manner.
But so what is the like advantage of taking this later, making graph and then prototyping?
Sure. Is a very good question. Goes to the basic of this idea of not trying to represent structure in data by graphs.
Yeah.
So the fundamental drawback, first, is the fact that graphs have arbitrary structure. In every instance, it can be big or small, and that's difficult to deal with. If you're computing a feature vector from a letter, like whatever, bounding boxes and measurements that are fixed in number, that's a feature vector directly, so why bother going through the graph representation first? You hope to capture structure and that structure is not lost in the embedding step. So a full experiment should actually take into account that, you're right, comparing whether really a graph-based representation can outperform another more straightforward way to compute the feature vector from the image. In physical graphs like structures of proteins, I think that's almost impossible to have a feature vector representation without passing through the graph-based one. But obviously in images and videos, like I didn't mention before, action recognition, which is really my more research area, graphs, articulated models are fitted on humans, and in alternative to that you can have a bigger feature. So,
like in, say, DPM, it's very famous, popular for object recognition. So it's a very weak graph with simple star kind of model chain, but it's not fully connected or some more. And then even in that, I don't think they use any graph property. They just compute these and they just look at the deformation coefficients and they learn from SVM, net and SVM and so on.
sure. Yeah, I agree. Yes, please.
Does this method still work when you have overlap between the classes if they're not mutually exclusive? It seems like it might not work well.
The notion of class overlap is more obvious in vector space because you have a vector space where you can visualize that. But here could be perfectly overlapping, and you're relying on redundancy in the prototype set to be able to separate. I didn't mention it before, you can fit kernels on distances, and therefore you can avail of kernels as an intermediate measurement of distance before you lay out AdaBoost or SVM to perform the actual classification. So potentially you can do nonlinear separation of classes, undoubtedly.
So these
In
are,
the geometry, there's a lot of things that count.
like these are the standard data sets.
Yes.
So like what is the state of art, and how does this method compare to the state of art?
I would say that the state of the art is the next slide. That actually, well, not exactly. If I'm allowed to mention this briefly, is in reply to the question I got before. This just presents the results between using the discriminative term against all the graphs of the complement of the other classes, or only what we call the nearest class. I would say results are kind of inconclusive. But there's a few more bold numbers on the versus all. So what we resorted to do is to measure the distances between this candidate graph and all the other graphs in all other classes, so exhaustively. And of course, if the data set becomes very, very big, this could be a problem because you have to take that into account. 1 second, sorry, do you have a question on this slide? Not particularly, so I'll move on to the next because I would like to answer Dr. Shah. So these are our main results. This is, by the end of the day, the main result slide is a comparison of what we got by adding the discriminative term versus the corresponding traditional technique that does not include a discriminative term in the objective function. And this may be showing it more clearly because it's just in percentage point, the improvement. It's 50 measurements, of which I would say only 2, 3 perhaps. In 3 cases, we are worsening in terms of empirical accuracy the performance of a corresponding technique, the boundary selection. But in all other cases, we improve. And in some cases, the improvement in terms of percentage point is not very remarked, but some of these data sets have accuracies close to 98, 99%, so it's not possible to go up much. In some other cases, like with CPS, we have an increase of a few percentage points.
So what is a web page graph? What will that be?
These are documents on the web divided into 20 classes. So you try to use, I don't know exactly again how the graph is built over the document, but the aim is to classify the document as to 20 sort of categories, business and the like. Still current question?
Yeah, I have a couple actually, but not related to the
Do you want to keep it for the end? Okay. I'm almost finished. I just have 2 more slides of results. This result is a set of selected cases for some of the techniques and some of the data sets. And they just report the accuracy as a function of the number of prototypes per class. The thick curve is the discriminative techniques, and the thin curve are the corresponding generative technique. Now, all I'm showing here is to reassure you that the results do not depend on a particular tuning in the number of prototypes. Even as you increase the number of prototypes per class, in all cases that we've monitored, the performance of the discriminative technique is better than the performance of the corresponding, let me call it again, generative technique or class-based technique. So, yeah, it's a fairly general results over these data sets. And the last thing I'm showing is an example of sensitivity to the choice of those 2 arbitrary parameters that set the trade-off between the generative term and the discriminative term. Those 2 parameters, we chose them with a grid search. At the moment, we don't have anything more intelligent than that. A grid search over the validation set. We have 2 parameters, WC, WS. In reality, all that counts is their ratio. So we have 1 free parameter. We put them on the simplex, so the sum is 1, and they're both between 0 and 1. The only free parameters is, say, WS or WC. Choose 1, and the other comes as the complement to 1. And we make them vary in steps of 0.01. So we did a grid search of 100 step points, looking for which gives the best accuracy. In some cases, we are lucky. The sensitivity over the choice of WS is small. So there are plateaus, flat areas where you can change, increase, the performance doesn't change. But other data sets, the performance changes significantly, like in the right side. It can vary by 2 percentage points or more. So it's a fundamental parameter, choosing what trade-off quantitatively between the generative term or traditional term and the discriminative term is, of course, very important in general. And at the moment, we don't have anything smarter than just try a grid search over these values. Luckily, it is 1 parameter. So a grid search over 1 parameter is not particularly scary. And I think that really is the slide before the conclusion. The conclusion is straightforward, is that comparing the traditional methods with these newly proposed discriminative methods show that on average the discriminative methods outperform, not just on average, actually basically in almost all cases. The discriminative technique outperforms the corresponding class-based technique. As I said before, as a second point, the choices of these objective functions is highly heuristic, and one could try to follow similar principles in adding terms to the objective and give it a try and see if it performs better. So there is a lot of margin for possible improvement, in my opinion. Last thing, good news, that as much as I talked about graphs today, as I sort of, in a way, not alluded, but sidelined certain questions about graph construction, the reality is that this work uses graphs, but can use any other known vector object. The real focus or scope of this work is about objects that are not vectors, but over which you can lay a distance. So that could include symbols, could include strings, could include sequence of symbols like DNA, could include anything. Whenever you can frame a distance, these techniques can be applied in a class-based or supervised exercise to find the best prototype set for the embedding in a dissimilarity space. That's it. Thank you. The next is just about taking questions.